My name is Kris Mauren, and I'm the executive director of the Acton Institute, which is an educational and public policy think tank concerned with the intersection of religion and free market economics. Our namesake, in case you're interested, is Lord Acton, who was the fellow who said power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I'm willing to wager that most of the world's problems that we can envision are at least partly caused by the hubris of power-corrupted political elites. So if you want to take me up on that challenge, please do. I'm lucky to be here on a regular basis annually for this terrific conference. I'm not sure it's because of my good looks or erudition. I think it's because I'm an advisory board member, which I'm humbled to be, and that means I get to throw lots of ideas at Anita in a couple phone calls, and she has the great task of sifting through and tossing out the dumb ones and putting together this terrific program. So thank you, Anita, for all the very hard work that you do. And of course, thank you to Hillsdale, what a great institution to bring all of us together, and to the Durrell Foundation for so generously supporting this annual conversation. Now, our panel topic is economic lessons from the economic union. And I'm going to warn you in advance, it's not a pretty picture in Europe. Europe is in trouble on all fronts, politically, economically, culturally, and some would argue even their very security threatened militarily. I know these themes will arise throughout the panel, and I, for one, don't like being pessimistic about Europe. Many of us in this room come from Europe at one point. I love many things about Europe. I love visiting. I love the food, languages, art, all kinds of things. I don't like their politics and economics. And if we're headed in that direction, please save us, which I think is the panel's job today, is to warn us what not to do. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Christopher Caldwell. He's a senior editor at the Weekly Standard and author of a terrific book called Reflections on the Revolution in Europe from a couple years ago. I suspect he's invited because that book created a bit of a conversation at that time around challenges to European culture over Islamic immigration. We ain't seen nothing yet. I imagine that's the theme of your talk. He writes about American and European affairs for many European and American publications, and I'm told he's working on a new book about America in the wake of the 1960s. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Caldwell.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Hillsdale for having me, for inviting me, and especially Anita Folsom for having arranged to make this all possible. I'm not going to be able to give a very wide-ranging talk today. One of the beautiful things about immigration as a subject is the way it draws in almost every aspect of, human social life, from economics to culture to languages to everything, but this is an economic forum. I'd like to focus on a couple of economic aspects of immigration, and specifically on ways in which, let's say, the mid-20th century welfare state has distorted some of the incentives around immigration. They're a little different in Europe, these distortions, than they are in the United States, but I think that we can learn from them nonetheless. Just to give a little bit of current events background, I think maybe some of you have been watching what's been going on in Central Europe now. You have refugees from the war in Syria have begun to lose patience with staying in camps in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, and have begun to move towards Europe. And over the summer, Angela Merkel, the chairman of Germany, said that Germany could probably welcome about 800,000 of them. Thus far, they have 1.5 million. That's the projection in Germany alone. And there's a problem with this particular migration, which is that while the route may have opened due to the war in Syria, it is a real business. The business of moving migrants is a business. It's a very lucrative, and it's quite a service you can provide to a family if you can get them out of poverty and into a European welfare state. So no one should ever call these traffickers of migrants exploiters, because at least they're not exploiters in the sense that they're offering the people, their clients, a worthless commodity. But anyway, this route can be traveled not just by Syrians, but also by Iraqis, Iranians, Pakistanis, Afghanis, Bangladeshis, and I met all of them on a recent trip to Austria a couple weeks ago. So what you have is a declaration, which has wound up being a declaration of open borders to Syria, which has been taken up by people from all over the Middle East, and that's what Europe is undergoing now. And it is, I have to say, if you will pardon my idiomatic language, it is really freaking European publics out. And it is turning politics upside down. And I think that one of the reasons that it has been hard to offer a resistance to this in European parliaments is that there's a great deal of mythology built up about how mass immigration is always good for a country. I mean, you run down the list, you know, when you say, well, I'm really worried about the immigration, Europeans will respond, okay, well, what's wrong with it? I mean, what's wrong with helping these people who've been fleeing this war that you see on TV? I mean, it's horrible. You look at the people dying over there, and you'd really have no answer to that, except you say, but they're not all fleeing the war. And the next question is, well, don't immigrants build up an economy? And that's, you know, and the answer is, yes, they can under certain circumstances, but I think that the European economy has been distorted in such a way that it benefits less from immigration than ours does. So that's what I'll talk about. When Europeans defend mass immigration, they tend to do so in two ways. When they defend the idea that there's a persistent structural need for it, sometimes they make a capitalist case, and sometimes they make which is that it strengthens the economy, and sometimes they make a socialist state, which is that it strengthens the state. And I think both arguments are somewhat illogical. All right, the capitalist case is this. Mass immigration is good because immigrants take jobs that no European will do. Now, what's really meant by this is that immigrants take jobs that no European will do at a particular wage. And these jobs tend to be ones that have fallen out of the European social welfare state system. Stuff that, you know, Europeans have a very generous welfare state, but there are still jobs that are not worth, you know, adding full health care and 20 or 30 years of retirement benefits to, certain menial jobs. Foreigners' main qualification for these jobs is their low expectations. Now, about a decade ago, the immigration specialist Philip Martin of the University of California, Davis, and some of his colleagues, they drew parallels that I thought were very fruitful between today's migrations and the movement of would-be settlers to European colonies in the 18th century. Back then, migrants often paid the cost of their resettlement through an indenture. That is, they'd promise a given number of years of labor to the landowner who fronted their voyage. And I think that maybe today, immigrants are paying a kind of an updated form of indenture. They pay it in the form of rights. They live in an ambiguous legal status that condemns them to only the lowest jobs. And so if there really are jobs that Europeans won't do, this indenture that immigrants labor under is a big part of what natives believe they're getting out of immigration. Now, whether or not this indenture is fair depends totally on the context in which you view it. On one hand, it's really corrosive. It creates two tiers of rights in a destination country, you know, and we had to talk about this a little bit with Obama's projected immigration reforms, which are not wholly without arguments. You know, you have people living in the country for 20 years. They've been working the whole time, and yet they cannot change jobs. On the other hand, the immigrants in their own native context, in the context of the countries where they came from, they're unlikely to complain. They're doing much better than they would have done in their native countries. And so there's a big argument to be had on both sides. But even if you like this arrangement, there's a hitch to it. Because the benefits of this indenture accrue to the immigrants' new countries only so long as immigrants are illegal and transitional. People always talk about stopping illegal immigration, but I'm afraid that for the purposes purely of economics, if we could ignore the political corrosion of law breaking and just stress on dollars and cents, for the purpose of economics, illegal immigrants are preferable to legal ones, okay? And the problem as far as the economy is concerned is that, or as far as the people who hire these people are concerned, is that immigrants don't stay that way forever. As soon as they're legally and socially assimilated in the way that society professes to want, they acquire a lot of rights and expectations. In the European context, they become Europeans, and they become these. And once they become Europeans, they become people who, by definition, won't do the jobs that Europeans won't do. You know what I mean? So you're stuck with a real paradox here, which is the moment immigration is successful socially, the main economic reason that society thinks it needs immigrants evaporates, and that has consequences for what you're getting when you get mass immigration. Mass immigration snowballs. It's a kind of a treadmill, because as soon as to use two metaphors that don't really go together, as soon as these immigrants become Europeans, then, in order to ensure that these jobs no European wants get done, society has to recruit a new replacement army of foreign-born workers without rights. And it sounds a great deal like the way Karl Marx describes capitalism. There is an alternative, and the alternative is to maintain the precariousness of immigrants' legal status into the next generation by denying birthright citizenship. But that doesn't sound like a very satisfactory arrangement for a republic either. Either way, you get in a situation where the economic gains from immigration are paid back in later generations. The economic gains from immigration are borrowed. They're not earned. So you accrue economic costs. Either you accrue economic costs or you pay off these economic costs in the form of constitutional rights. This is a rather complex point that I go into a lot more in my book, and I don't really have time to really get into here. My main point about this capitalist case is that the capitalist case for immigration is that it doesn't reckon with the damage that is done by the way that societies get addicted to immigration. Now let's talk about the socialist case, which quite naturally you hear a lot more of in Europe. We have a picture in our head of the European welfare state in its heyday, which is right now, it's probably a little bit exaggerated. There are countries like Austria and maybe France that retain that kind of old-fashioned welfare state of, like the 32-hour week and the 7-week vacation and, pensions that are like right next to your maximum earnings and, total free health care. But other European welfare states like Germany, Britain have really, they've cut back. Europeans used to always condescend to Americans about the difference between our welfare state and theirs. They'd say things like, well, Americans live to work, but we Europeans, we work to live, and so, aren't we grand, And so you look, we can now see, and I don't want to be too rude about it, but, in the wake of the 2008 crash, it seems more likely that any differences in the system can be accounted for by Europeans having taken more from the future, having borrowed more on the future than Americans did, which, by the way, is no mean feat. Now, in Europe, as here, this system wound up spurring immigration in unanticipated ways, okay? And that's because all government pension systems operate whatever they may call, use the word trust fund, but that's baloney. They all operate on a pay-as-you-go basis. That is, they pay present benefits to retirees out of present tax receipts. They don't let no individual worker saves for his retirement through Social Security, okay? Polemicists and welfare economists have always noted the tendency of such systems as they come under democratic pressure to degenerate into Ponzi schemes. That is, they lead politicians to overpromise and to cover those promises by roping in new investors, that is, taxpayers, to transfer for more money to current beneficiaries than the system can really afford in exchange for votes, And in societies with growing populations, this can really work. Because, for a short time, because the welfare support ratio grows too. The welfare support ratio is the ratio of laborers to beneficiaries, But politicians are tempted to loot for their own purposes the entire surplus that comes from having a temporary bulge of people of working age, rather than invest it for the time when that bulge of workers becomes a bulge of retirees, Europe's politicians were not any more capable of resisting this temptation than our politicians were. And so after the baby boom the baby boom generation went to work, these ratios grew and grew and grew. And now that the boomers are retiring, the support ratio is shrinking fast. In countries like Spain, I would like to look at the actual ratio now, but it's heading towards 2-to-1, which is, which is a very low ratio. Now, and due to falling birth rates, which is a problem that feeds into this and is tied to it in complex ways, there is no next generation of workers large enough to restore the system to balance. So a reckoning awaits, or it used to await, now it's here, okay? And now, so who is going to save this system? Who is going to be the generator of jobs and productivity that is going to pay for Europeans' retirements? A lot of Europeans say, immigrants, they will pay for it. We'll bring people in. It'll be great. And so they're the sort of, the way I put it a few years ago is that these people are supposed to sort of emerge from the desiccated and starving hamlets of the third world and ride to the rescue of the retirement checks and second homes, the wine tastings and snorkeling vacations of the most pampered workforce in the history of the planet. I think I wrote that at about 3 o'clock in the morning. but that's not going to work either. And there are a few reasons which I'll zip through before I end. First is, the welfare state requires a lot more newcomers to prop it up than any public will tolerate. I mean, Europe is very upset now about what looks like it's going to be 1 or 2 million people this year. It's going to grow a lot next year, but the United Nations Population Division does calculations of how many immigrants Europe would need to pay for its welfare state. It's interesting that the United Nations thinks this is a proper thing to do, as if the welfare state is like a fact of nature that needs to be preserved in Europe, you know. But it would take about 154 million immigrants in mid-century to, I mean, so we're talking about a third of the country's population. The country would have to grow by a third, and it would have to all be working age young people, and that would save it, except that it wouldn't. And the reason it wouldn't is that immigrants are not immortal. They too age and retire, and the system has to take care of them. And they're larger than average families. And Europeans have tended to face this problem with little more than wishful thinking. I want to quote something from a UK Home Office report from late 2007. It wrote, "In the long term, migrants themselves will age and contribute to the increasing dependency ratio, but only assuming that they remain in the UK during their retirement." So this is the assumption. This is the assumption of Britain's government. Okay, the assumption is these people are going to come at the start of their career. They're going to slave for British retirement benefits for 45 years, and then just on the eve of the moment when they can actually collect them, they're going to go back home and they're going to like live in the Sahara somewhere, you know, and say, "No, you can keep the money. I did it because I love the British welfare state so much." So there's the third reason is immigrants don't earn enough, and maybe that will change, but it will be a matter of generations, you know, before that happens. It's not, and I have to say that the final reason, and the main reason, that immigrants do not provide a rescue for the European social system is that immigration on the scale envisioned will transform Europe and transform European identities and transform the peoples and the institutions to the point where a term such as welfare state, while people may still employ it, will have a totally different meaning because it will be in a totally different cultural context. A Europe with hundreds of millions of non-Europeans in it is going to want non-European things. I'm not saying that non-Europeans can't become Europeans. There are many examples of that you can read about every day. But for them to become Europeans requires a certain amount of social pressure on migrants. And when migrants come in the tens of millions to a continent that is short of workers, short of elan, and short of self-confidence, they're unlikely to feel that pressure. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christopher. Just coincidentally, about 6 weeks ago, I was in Turkey and then Hungary, just at the moment of the worst in Hungary, with people sleeping by the thousands in front of the trains and walking literally toward the rest of Europe through Hungary, and the day that they closed the fence. And I have to tell you, it's impossible to underestimate the level of angst and conversation across all of Europe on this particular issue. So thank you, Christopher, for raising that to our attention. Now, our next panelist is going to talk about another significant major European crisis with lots of ripple effects over time that seems to be so much of yesterday's problem, the problem of Greece. But we know, as I know John will probably surely tell us, this will be a problem for tomorrow and probably beyond many tomorrows, because it's a problem that keeps getting kicked down the road. So helping us to understand the particular issue of Greece and what that portends for the rest of Europe, I'd like to invite John O'Sullivan here. Now, many of you know John. He's a journalist, author, and lecturer, and a current fellow of the National Review Institute. He's also an editor-at-large for National Review, and he was, in fact, the editor-in-chief for almost a decade until 1998. He also, as many of you will know, was a special advisor with a very special, long-standing intellectual and personal friendship with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, one of our movement's great heroes. And he's the author of a fantastic book called The President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister, on the roles of Thatcher, President Reagan, and Pope John Paul II in the collapse of communism and the revival of Western democracies. Mr. Sullivan is also the former executive editor of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Now, to help enlighten us on Greece, past, present, and future, John O'Sullivan.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Mr. Chairman, many thanks for your kind words, which I very much appreciate. Secondly, it's a great pleasure to be on the platform with Christopher Caldwell and Barbara Kolm, both of whom I know. In fact, one of the two things I do at the moment, edit Quadrant in Australia and run a small think tank in Budapest called the Acton Institute. It's quite a commute. One of the things we've done at the Acton Institute is to have a conference jointly with Barbara and her institute. And in fact, it was the Free Market Roadshow, and it had similar intentions to this today. Christopher is an old friend and whom I managed to persuade occasionally to write for the various magazines I work for. You may have noticed, if you weren't paying close attention to Christopher, you should have been paying, that for a few minutes there I was feeling complete and utter desperation because my speech couldn't be gouged out of the internet system, and I hadn't yet got the laptop. I hope I carried it off gallantly, but I certainly felt a bit nervous. But that said, let me say that I want to begin with a straightforward thank you. It's a privilege to be invited to this forum, which, like all events run by Hillsdale, is a fine blend of high living and high thinking, to the extent that the motto of the organization might well be mens sana in corpore sano. We all benefit from both aspects, and we meet old friends on both sides of the podium, so many thanks. On this occasion, we do have a very rich topic here, and the college has given this panel a particularly rich subject. The European Union, its current refugee and migrant crisis, its long-running crisis built around the euro, and finally how the euro and its different crises have impacted on Greece. I should say that there's no way in which I'm not going to intrude somewhat on Barbara's topic. It's just unavoidable, really. But I don't think we'll be saying very different things, except we probably will be saying them very differently. Now, all of these questions are interrelated. Each one affects the other, and all are potentially very damaging. Now, that's obviously true of the refugee crisis just described by Christopher. It's also obvious, I think, about the long-running Greece crisis, which has provoked 3 elections this year alone, 2 elections and a referendum, destroyed 2 major governing parties in the country, and installed in power a semi-Trotskyist leader with ties to Venezuela, Castro, and the world's far left. As for the third topic, you may once have thought that currency fluctuations and exchange rates were rather dull subjects. Oscar Wilde knew better. In The Importance of Being Earnest, he has Miss Prism tell her pupil, "Cecily, you will read your political economy in my absence. The chapter on the fall of the rupee you may omit. It is somewhat too sensational. Even these metallic problems have their melodramatic side." Well, they do indeed. And in the past 3 years, European politics has been roiled by the constant problems that have emerged over the relationship between Greece and the euro. These have included a series of funding crises for countries inside the euro that found themselves at risk of being unable to borrow on the international markets because investors doubted they could meet their interest payments. A series of financial bailouts of these countries by the EU and the IMF that were both against the rules of the institutions, and then, of course, in addition, various short-term fixes that led mainly to the next crisis and the next bailout. A protracted recession in southern Europe, leading to youth unemployment levels of over 50%, and the unemployment levels of adults sometimes above 20%, generally between 10 and 20. The rise, number 4, the rise of extremist parties across Europe, and especially in Greece, in Spain, and in Italy. And finally, 5, the removal of 2 democratically leaders in Greece and Italy as a result of a shady conspiracy between Brussels, Berlin, and in one case, the Italian presidency. If you read Tim Geithner's memoirs, there's an interesting reference to this, something he's uneasy and shameful about. Unless you know what it is, you couldn't possibly work it out from what he says. But when you know that the administration was engaged in a conspiracy to get rid of Berlusconi, it becomes, you can follow it then. Now, all these 3 crises share something in common. They arose because the EU had embarked upon major collective political reforms without thinking seriously about possible consequences and unexpected consequences and possible solutions if they should fail. For instance, the Schengen reforms abolished internal frontier controls throughout Europe without ensuring first that Europe's external borders were secure. So once a migrant entered one European country, he could move freely through all European countries. Getting off a boat at Bari in the morning, he could be in Berlin by dinner time. And that's how a refugee crisis begins. The problem of Greece is a subset of the euro problem, which arises from the fact that the euro is a political project far more than it is an economic one. It was put in place a decade ago with features that a purely economic project would never have incorporated. It included too many countries, their economic characters were too divergent, their levels of employment, inflation, and productivity were too different, their financial structures for housing and pensions were in conflict, and so on and so on. The overall result of these differences was that some countries, notably those in the Mediterranean, around the Mediterranean, were locked by the euro into an overvalued exchange rate in comparison with elsewhere, notably those countries bordering the Baltic, including Germany. It was impossible to set a single interest rate that would be suitable for all of them. An interest rate that held back economic growth in one country would encourage reckless borrowing in another, by incidentally both the public and the private sectors. Also, unlike the dollar, the pound, the public, and the dollar, the pound, the renminbi, the Swiss franc, the euro did not have a proper system of government. There was no economic government of the eurozone that could run a Europe-wide fiscal policy in line with the European Central Bank's monetary policy. And though these features of the euro guaranteed economic dislocation and perverse outcomes, the eurozone did not have 3 things needed to reconcile those differences or deal with the dislocations. It didn't have flexibility of wages. It didn't have transnational labor mobility in practice, and it didn't have transnational monetary transfers. In fact, the euro was sold to the Germans by the slogan, "No bailouts," which was soon forgotten. Well, we could say more about those things. But the euro became very quickly a fetish for Germany's political elites, and over time a fetish for all of Europe's political elites. And as you may recall from Herbert Spencer, he said that anyone who denied the government fetish suffered a terrible fate. He was described as a believer in laissez-faire, and no one ever heard of him again. Equally, anyone who denied the euro fetish was banished from mass media to the obscurity of small opinion magazines. Today, it is hardly possible to deny that the deniers had a point, but the fetish continues to exert some power. Now, I'd better skip ahead there. I'm limited to 20 minutes, Mr. President, but once I start talking, I lose all sense of time. So you're going to have to tell me when I have 3 minutes to go. Let me offer a few criticisms of why that's a bad thing, which leads directly to Greece. The first and most important is that the policies, well, I'll skip ahead there too. We've concentrated a lot in the euro on the funding crisis. But in fact, even when that is completely solved, which I don't think it has been, the Mediterranean countries still remain locked into a vertiginously unfavorable exchange rate represented by the euro. And so far as they remain in the currency, they will be locked into that exchange rate and in economic austerity without end. At the same time, Northern Europe will be locked into paying an endless flow of subsidies to them. This represents a loss of wealth at both ends. The long-term effect would be to transform much of Europe into one large Mezzogiorno, or East Germany, for decades. That's an opinion shared by two economists as different as Václav Klaus and Paul Krugman. Now, that doesn't mean to say it's the correct view, of course, but it establishes the fact that it is not an eccentric or marginal view. The second criticism is the policy is an expression of institutionalized historicism. Admirers of Karl Popper here will recall his criticism was that historicism was an impoverished theory. It replaces serious debate about different policy choices with a defeatist accommodation to some supposed inevitability. But as Keynes remarked, and this is one occasion where I think you'll agree with Keynes, the unexpected always happens. The inevitable, never. In this case, the policy reflects a determination never to retreat from a previous advance towards an ever closer union of the European Union promised in the treaties. A myth of inevitability is the very definition of historicism, and the statements of European leaders on the euro repeatedly endorse that mental approach. I would have thought myself that Europe had already suffered quite enough from the politics of historical inevitability in the last century, but I'm an Anglo-Saxon empiricist, so what does that matter? My third criticism is that this policy is incompatible with democracy, and this is where we see this most clearly in Greece. The remedies embodied in the fiscal union essentially entail promises by governments of nation states to keep their structural deficits within agreed limits and to submit their budgets for approval before presenting them to national parliaments. When I first began to look at this a few years ago, I didn't have the example of Greece. So I invented an imaginary, I didn't invent the imaginary kingdom of Ruritania. That's a long-standing idea, but I examined how Ruritania might find itself in these circumstances. If a Ruritanian budget, I thought, was presented to Brussels and passed with distinction, not much happened. If the budget was disallowed by Brussels, however, would the Parliament be able to proceed with it, or would Ruritania feel it couldn't do so? And what if the budget reflected a wider set of government economic priorities that had just been endorsed by the Ruritanian voters? In each of these examples, the EU has intervened, perhaps decisively, in Ruritanian domestic politics. We can sum it up as follows. If the Ruritanian budget does not need to be approved by Brussels, then the fiscal union rests on the same shaky foundations as the 1997 Stability and Growth Pact that was quietly abandoned with little or no protest from Brussels in the early years of the century before the euro had even run into crises. If it does not need the approval of Brussels, then Ruritania has ceased to be governed democratically in fiscal matters, which are 95% of politics. That is not altered in the slightest by the fact that Ruritania might be represented on the Brussels Decision-Making Committee. Nor can it be seriously argued that Ruritania would be sharing in pooled sovereignty or shared sovereignty with its European partners. Shared sovereignty creates a new sovereign power, namely the EU, and deprives the previous sovereign power, in this case Ruritania, of its authority. All assurances to the contrary are bogus. And perhaps I could put it metaphorically. A bachelor is a sovereign power. A married man enjoys the benefits of shared sovereignty. Now, when we turn to Greece, we find everything that I predicted about Ruritania actually happening in practice. In earlier years, all the Greek political parties, except the then tiny and marginal Trotskyist party, Syriza, signed on to a memorandum of understanding with the Northern European Troika that imposed heavy spending cuts on the country. These were necessary because Greece couldn't pay its bills because it couldn't devalue, because it was in the euro, because it couldn't pay its bills. nobody was going to lend it money, and it would need other people to lend it money. So effectively, they had to go to, they went to the European Union and to the IMF. Now, during this period, as I say, Syriza was a small party. There then followed a crisis and several elections in which the major parties were all rejected by the Greeks, and Syriza broke through on a manifesto of rejecting the cuts, austerity, and the memorandum of understanding. They then held a referendum that endorsed their rejection. That vote strengthened Syriza's hand politically. Now, let's be clear. It had absolutely no other democratic or moral authority. Countries cannot vote themselves access to other people's treasuries, which is what Syriza wanted to do. But nonetheless, they were encouraged to think this might be possible, as indeed it has proved to be, by the other countries in the euro, because the other countries wanted Greece to stay in. So in a way, they were able to use the other countries' desire not to have any threat to the euro, which I don't think it was, by the way, you're telling me I've got 15 minutes, okay. I'm going to, okay. Now, so that being the case, the government went through a series of neat meetings in which it needed large sums of money. It now, by the way, has borrowed so much money that it cannot conceivably be paid for another 130 years, A, and B, it can't, it's at the moment, they are not meeting the targets that the IMF and the EU have set to justify the bailout. And we'll see how that turns out. Now, the fifth criticism is that this policy will encourage the political extremism that the European Union was allegedly devised to overcome. Governments in democracies cannot simply impose unpopular policies on their voters. They are even less able to do so when the policies are imposed on them from outside. And when they attempt to do so, they sow dragon's teeth in the form of extreme populist movements that promise to reject what the Orthodox Democrats have accepted. Today, Alex Tsipras, the leader of a party who was unknown, is inspiring leftist movements all over Europe and dragging a respectable social democratic party towards a policy of reckless spending, expropriation, and I would say the general outlook drawn from the playwright Dario Fo, whose his best-known play is Can't Pay, Won't Pay. And that is, in a way, the attitude of the European left as a result of the Greek crisis. Now, in the recent 3 months ago, in the great debate over whether to bail out Greece, Tsipras and the German finance minister, Schäuble, were on opposite sides. In fact, Schäuble had devised a very good temporary Grexit option, which would have actually created a much better outlook for both Europe and for Greece. They would have left the euro, I think, it was said temporarily, I doubt if it would have been temporary, and they would have been given upfront debt relief. The fact is, of course, that's the only way that Greece can return to anything like stability, because while it's still climbing out of an endless austerity, it's never going to be able to have the resources to pay back the debts. I mean, if you make it impossible for someone to prosper, then you make it impossible to repay their debts. And in a sense, that's what the entire Greek people are in that situation at the moment. Of course, they are paying back some of their debts, but the latest news as of yesterday was that whereas they are supposed to have amassed enough funds equal to 0.5% of their GDP this year, the IMF estimates that they are going to actually, they claim they've done that. The IMF claims that they have actually reached only half that figure. And I do not see how a country which is facing an exchange rate which effectively means that it will be forever climbing up an incredibly difficult financial and economic hill. I don't see how it's going to be able to assemble the resources and to save enough to be able to get out of this situation. As I say, Schäuble devised a humane solution. Greece would leave the euro, receive generous debt relief to stabilize, grow its economy, allow the drachma to find a natural level and re-enter the euro in due course. I don't believe that. For this, he was denounced as a brutal thug. His proposal was disavowed by Mrs. Merkel, and the bailout that really is unworkable was then approved over his, not his objections, but over his reluctance. Another element in this, which I think you should pay attention to, which ties into what was said by Christopher a moment ago, is that let me find this, sorry. The left throughout Europe the left throughout Europe suddenly decided that all of the things that were supposed to be part of the euro deal, namely, if you can't pay, if you can't run your economy, then Europe's got to run it for you. It suddenly decided that this was undemocratic, and it wouldn't do it. Well, it is undemocratic. But on the other hand, if you make yourself a debtor, your creditors are going to have some influence on your actions. And the situation in Europe at the moment is, on the one hand, there is an attempt to pretend that is the case, but almost every time it reaches crisis point, the creditors give in, and the debtors live another day. That doesn't help the debtors, because they're in an unsustainable position. And in fact, one of the results of this is they have to save. They may not save enough, but when they do, and when they give it to the creditors then use it to buy industries and other things which are being privatized. Well, I'll leave it at that point. It's just to say that some of those problems were eminently foreseeable, but no one bothered to do anything to ensure they didn't occur. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I was not lucky enough 30 years ago to attend Hillsdale, where no student leaves without a great introduction to Austrian economics. But providentially, as a freshman at some not-to-be-named college, I was exposed to Austrian economics at the Foundation for Economic Education. And one terrific professor at that time, Howie Bacher, who's here with us. Howie, please wave. I owe a lot to you. Excellent. Introduced me to Austrian economics and made me an enthusiastic evangelist. One of the things I did, as I recall, was buy 200 copies of the law and beat all my college friends over the head with it for several years. At one point, a couple years later, I went to Austria for the first time, a marvelous and beautiful country, and was shocked that I couldn't find anyone who had heard of the Austrian School of Economics or Mises and Hayek. I was so crushed, I knew I had a lot of work ahead of me to introduce Austrian economics. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker, Dr. Barbara Kolm. She is, in fact, president of the Friedrich Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria, whose mission is the revival of Austrian economics in that country. She's also director of the Austrian Economics Center. She's an associate professor of Austrian economics at the University of Donja Gorica in Montenegro. She writes widely, and I see her turn up speaking at many, many think tank forums and international gatherings where public intellectuals meet and discuss economics. She's a terrific manager of a worldwide think tank and a great economist. Please join me in welcoming Barbara to talk about the common currency and its problems.
Thank you, Kris, for this kind introduction. I would also like to thank Anita Folsom for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here at the place, obviously, where Austrian economics is valued highly. And we have had a couple of interns in Vienna from Hillsdale College, and it was a pleasure to work with them, and I have to give credit to you who educate them, how well educated they are. So thank you for doing this great job. My presentation today, of course, was a little bit hijacked by John, but it doesn't matter at all, because being a European, it would be too one-sided to only cover the so-called common currency, which is a huge problem. I would like to present the current situation as it is right now. The EU has led plans to strengthen the monetary union. But actually those official documents that we have just seen are more than ambiguous at best, if we could say. France wants a voluntarist economic government in contrast to what Germany wants. And you have already mentioned what Schäuble's vision and Schäuble's idea. The Germans want to stick to a rules-based economic constitution. So you see the differences and the contrasts could not be larger. In addition to that, we see Cameron, who wants a change of the treaties before the British vote and the referendum, which by no means will happen because Brussels, and by Brussels I mean the European politicians, those who are in power, they cannot dare to take this risk, because if a treaty change should happen, then it's definitely not in favor of the European Union. People's ideas towards, or the sentiment towards the EU has changed largely in the past 2 years. Actually, it started already when the first bailouts happened with Greece. Back then, everybody fell into the trap, into the political trap that Angela Merkel has laid out as a politician very wisely, by tying the fate of the European Union with the survival of the euro. So we all know these are completely two different things, and you don't put them in one basket. Merkel, as a politician, wisely did so, and everybody fell into this trap. And until now, everybody of those politicians who are in power believe that. And I think this tragedy of this that we see these days is also one result. Another thing that I would like to emphasize is that both the French and the Germans, they both want this federalized Europe, the more integration, but with different ideas in the background, as I mentioned. But the treaty adaptation is not on the table right now. But it is without question that Germany would have, and this is very important, would have to change its constitution of 1949 if the treaties are to be changed. And we will, you will hear later as well, the Europeans, actually Germany, has already a tough and a serious problem with the constitution, with their own constitution, that they have broken when it comes to European Stability Mechanism, EFSF, and the other bailouts. So these are issues that we have on the plate, plus, and this is the most important thing, and this is why the sentiment towards the European Union has changed so much in the past, is that Europe has definitely failed on 3 fronts in the past decades. The one is the common currency, that the results of that are being made visible with the Greek crisis. And ever since the financial crisis, the so-called financial crisis, hit Europe, which is nothing else for us than making the sovereign debt crisis visible. The sovereign debt crisis that roots from those terrible welfare states that Christopher has already discussed, and that we unfortunately are unable to kill. So we have the monetary crisis, the debt crisis. We have Ukraine, where we terribly failed as a European Union, and as a consequence also on the defense level and on securing our outer borders, and of course helping nations who are actually more European than Russian or anything else. And the third point is the so-called migration crisis, which is not a migration crisis per se, because again here our politicians do a very good job in throwing putting everything into one basket. And the one-size-fits-all solution is also true here. Those migrants have three different routes. One is the war. The people who flee from war, those refugees, it's about 1/3 that come to Europe. The other third is people from Kosovo, Serbia, Macedonia, the Balkans, that are economic refugees, if you want to call it like that, who seek a better future in our welfare states, but also, and this is most important, are willing to work. And those guys have done that 30 years ago and 40 years ago, and they were just our guest workers. And those people should just be welcome by all means and allowed to work immediately and not put in refugee camps. And the third group is the sub-Saharan Africans, mostly male, 17 to 28 years old with a Muslim background, who are sent on a mission also to seek a positive and good future in Europe. Time flies again, so I just simply also will fly over those couple of slides that I have presented. But I would like to point out that this peace project that was laid out after World War II is actually now an entire political project. And you cannot run a continent only politically. You have to look at economics. I mean, these are the principles. We don't have growth in Europe anymore. I mean, you cannot call 0.8% an average growth. I mean, this is ridiculous. So these things are our real problems. And finally, let me say, I mean, our politicians live or seem to live in a parallel universe. They simply don't look at the facts and figures. They don't care for those, having this big political project in mind. I would like to also, let me finally get into the presentation. We have to look at the reality with the euro. I mean, we have not all European member states of those 27 member states use the euro as a currency. It's as a matter of fact, it's 2/3. I mean, Finland, Great Britain, Sweden, Great Britain, Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, Hungary are out of the euro. They use their own currencies, and only a couple of countries have their currency pegged to the euro, which is Denmark and Bulgaria. And I think this needs also to be taken into consideration. We have two important and different views of Europe that I already pointed out. This is the France and the German issue, or you could also say the socialist and the Republican, or the more democratic, Christian democratic vision of Europe. And I would simply start with what Milton Friedman actually pointed out. And Milton Friedman was very critical about the euro, and now we unfortunately, or we have to say, yes, right, he was. Those flexible rates would work, and if we allowed them without interference. And we have already heard before by the previous speakers that because of this political intervention that we see these days, the ECB, the European Central Bank, is not independent anymore. It was supposed to be, and I will come a little bit later to the points that Issing made, but right now this is definitely not the case. I would say the shocks, the economic shocks, can be absorbed in a single currency. Look at the United States, it has happened plentiful and it worked out. Imbalances are always there. But in Europe, it does not work because of this one-size-fits-all policies and the ideas that we have to do everything with the same solutions. We know that what the US have tried in the 30s did not work out. And unfortunately, we fall into exactly the same trap, doing the same thing. This quote, I think, stands for itself, and there is nothing to add. However, I would like to bring in a very Hayekian idea into consideration, competing currencies that actually Ottmar Issing, who was one of the ECB board members and one of the German National Bank's heads, pointed out. He made a very eloquent defense of the euro back then and in 2000 and tried to bring in the idea that you have to untouch money and finance policy. However, this was the original idea of the euro, but reality shows that now it doesn't happen. So those expectations did not work out. And Hayek's ideas with the competing currencies, unfortunately, are also completely forgotten. We would have to have a look that now we are 15 years into this euro experiment, and we still try to use the same solutions and follow in. And the same solutions that have not worked out. I would like to focus on two more things that are important. This classical liberal view that I already mentioned, which was when we look back in history and the European Union was founded, are the first steps towards the coal and steel union, and then following up with the European Common Market. The history in 1957, 59, 68, when Maurice Schumann and Alice de Gasperi and also Adenauer and the Christian Democrats had their project for the values. And their values were individual liberty and freedom. And people who decide for themselves, they believed in the subsidiarity principle, they believed in not in the nation states as we know it right now, but they believed that in sovereign nations who govern themselves, who are the owners of their tax revenues, who make their decisions, and if the budgets run out of balance, then they are held responsible for that. Whereas in contrast to the French and socialist view, which is actually the classic Delors and Mitterrand program, where we aim for a central state, this big central Europe that is governed out of Brussels by technocrats and bureaucrats who are not elected. And this is a big problem that we face. And we now run into this redistribution on the supranational level, which is actually, thanks to the socialist ideas, a huge disaster. And by, under the disguise of protecting the consumer, we run into regulation after regulation, which destroys competition and productivity in Europe, and also the environmental, the entrepreneurial environment. As a matter of fact, 2/3 of the French population, of the labor force, are directly or indirectly are working for government, for the French government, either because they are bureaucrats, or teachers, etc., or because they run or they work in the big state-owned companies. Do you think that a nation like that is productive, and those people earn the taxes are used well, in contrast to the German so-called Mittelstand, where you have a lot of small and medium-sized companies that pay their taxes, that hire people, and that are very creative and innovative. And I think this innovation, the lack of innovation that we see these days in Europe, is a huge problem. So we all know that this bailout of Europe has failed. I would simply come with a couple of figures and numbers about Greece, and then you will see that we actually cannot afford this stuff anymore. Just to give you an idea. The first bailout was 110 billion, followed by 130 billion, only Greece. Then we had Ireland with 85 billion, we had Portugal with 78 billion, and the first round was 430, which led to this ESM that I already mentioned. Right now, we are in the program of QE3 with 1 trillion, a release of 60 billion euros monthly, starting this spring, ending next fall. But we already know this is not enough. We will have to take more on those balance sheets, and the QE4 is already in discussion, and the prolonging of this bailout program as well. And our politicians are playing a couple of tricks on our European citizens. It's not only that we do QE, we have the Target 2 program, we have the new Juncker plan, which is in addition to the European Stability Mechanism, nothing else but a huge leverage system, again, that will help huge distortions. So what are the alternatives? What are the solutions? One could say, okay, if the Greeks did not leave, and by the way, I wrote an article in 2010 predicting, well, economists should not predict, and as an Austrian, I should not say anything, since we all know there is no such thing as full information. But by reason, and having underestimated the political desire to stay in power, by sheer reason, one would have had the Greeks leave the euro back then already, and let a couple, and this has to be stated, and let a couple of banks go bust. But this did not happen just because we needed to save the euro and the European Union. So I mentioned one point at the beginning, and this is something where one has to give credit, but in the wrong way. We need NATO. Greece is a NATO position, back the furthest and southeast, and actually we need that. And given what is happening further in the east, it's even more important. But I tell you why Greece is a failed nation, and it's now under protectorate of Brussels. Greece still remains the largest defense spending country within the NATO, the 28 members, in relation to its GDP. It has 500 misarranged military bases and 17 training camps. So, those things don't work, but money is still put there. And the German taxpayer is actually paying for that. Our other nations, Great Britain, I mentioned the referendum. Ireland is fragile, but better now. They left the umbrella. Portugal is still in dire straits, and with the current elections, next elections coming, we might face another socialist, communist government. I would not be so mildly as what you said about Tsipras. They are communists, and by that you just destroy an entire continent. Germany is still the leading economy, apart from some diesel problems, but I'm sure they will overcome that, or at least their lawyers and their technicians. Italy is no more Dolce Vita, but they have a wheat belt, a bacon belt, from Venice to Milan to Torino, which is still working, and they are the small and medium-sized enterprises, work hard, gather revenues, and are flexible. One more thing, we need structural reforms. Without structural reforms, Europe is doomed. And the same thing what the Social Democrat Schröder did when he was Chancellor, this needs to be done for entire Europe. We need to do our structural reforms in pension, in taxes, school, and social welfare. So those four big things need to be touched, and then there might be a solution for a Europe or for a euro, but I doubt it that we will see this in the next 2-3 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Obviously, we have a very learned and experienced panel on the various crises in Europe. Now, we do have just under 20 minutes for some questions. We do have microphones around the room, so please hold up your hand and wait for a microphone. We'll start on this side of the room. Thank you.
I'm Joe Prack. The way some of these I don't know about all of them, but the ones that I'm familiar with, which is most, they not only don't force relatively undesirable immigrants to become part of their culture, they pander to their differences. We've been in France probably 50 times. Nowadays, you're afraid to go to France because there are all these, 400 or so zones where normal people can't travel because they are occupied by some mosque and its surrounding gang. In Holland, in South Africa, when the Dutch controlled that and the French wanted to send immigrants, they had rules. You can stay here if you learn Dutch within 2 years. That was in the 1700s. That was a very good idea. And now, in Holland itself, are they doing things to cause the Turks and whoever is coming to assimilate into the Dutch culture? No.
Thank you. I think this touches on one of the great angst in Europe right now, which is the threats to, if I can say it, Christian culture. Christopher, I think you've written quite a bit on this. Would you care to respond?
Yeah, I have. This is, it's tough to know which way to go on this, and I think that's why Europe has failed so much. When you talk about the no-go zones in France, or as they call them, zone de non-droit, I don't think it's that any particular mosque has sort of like laid down the law and says this is our area. But there are areas, what's going on is something very much like what happened in the United States in the late 1970s, where for whatever reason, the country feels it has lost the legitimacy to enforce the law. It feels it has been unfair to poor people, to ethnic minorities, to whatever. And there is less enforcement in those places. It might also be, I think you also hear people who live in those areas claim that it's actually neglect, that the government doesn't care about those people enough to sort of enforce the law in there. In general, though, we have a situation in France where it does resemble our crime in the late 70s. I'll also touch on the expectation of cultural assimilation. It's very controversial in Europe because if you teach, and this is coming up now, if you teach the Syrians German who are coming to Germany, why would you teach them German? You teach them German if you expect them to stay. If you let them keep speaking Arabic, you can present this migration to the public as being a temporary thing. So there are some perverse political incentives that do keep people from from immigrating? I guess it comes down to Europe's lack of a melting pot type culture of the sort that we have.
Bill Penn, Belhaven University. And I'll address this to Mr. Caldwell, although it affects each one of you, each one of our speakers. To what extent do you think the decline in Christian values in the home has caused a lot of these problems? And I think of the whole area of personal responsibility to the family, honoring your word, looking at the long-term implications of your decisions. And again, when I think of pensions, to what extent do you have a responsibility to your children and your children to your parents? And we could go on and on. But we see this decline in our country as well, and of course it has been occurring in Europe for a lot longer period. So I wonder if you'd comment on that. Thank you.
As you say, sir, we could go on and on. This is a subject for a large conference, and this panel is about economics, and you know, it would take a day to go over things like keeping your word and things like that. But if we could just look at one area of direct overlap with economics, which is the family as a generator of population, as the generator of the next generation, right? Then you can say that, you know, again, it's a complicated matter how Christianity feeds into that. But the fact that Europe is no longer made up of two-parent families having 4 or 5 children is the reason this is happening. Let's just try and get to that at brass tacks. Europe is going through these problems because it is not replacing its culture. And there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be kept running, so it needs to import a culture to run that infrastructure. That's probably the simplest way to address it.
I know there was interest on our other two panelists for a quick response. John?
Yes. There's if you read Chesterton's biography, there's a story in it in which he tells of how his father came home to dinner one evening. The Chestertons were and are, by the way, a big real estate company in England, in London. His father came home to dinner one evening and was in a very bad mood, and he said, well, he was terribly shocked because someone who was selling a house in which he was the purchaser the agent had proposed to him that they agree on a higher price than the market price and split the difference between them with fees. And he said he for the first time in his career, which was then advanced, this was the first time anybody had ever made such a suggestion to him. Now, when we compare that with the moral stories that emerged, or immoral stories, during the Wall Street crash, of how people on Wall Street were actually conspiring with each other to defraud many of their clients. What we're seeing here is you cannot have a sound commercial morality, it seems to me, unless you have a sound general social morality, and that is one of the many things that have gone. And in searching for some comfort here, and there isn't much, I would say we must realize that we have in Europe, certainly, and in this country too, Christians have allies in the post-Christians, the people who, while they no longer believe in God or the faith, nonetheless love the society which was created by Christianity. And I'm thinking of people like Douglas Murray in England and others, and who can be recruited to support both the culture of Christianity and some of the more obviously relevant moral precepts.
Barbara?
Just quickly, we have substituted the churches with bureaucratic institutions in Europe. And by that, we have also forgotten about our Christian values, Judeo-Christian values, which is, you know, also this living within our means, to be self-responsible, to be competitive, and also to achieve is something that we have completely delegated We've forgotten it. And we have delegated those values to a higher reason to the state. The government is taking care of everything by now. And we no longer do it ourselves, solve our problems ourselves. If you look at the budgets, the national budgets, 2/3 in average, I mean, some are better, luckily, but my home country, Austria, which has been quoted, and many others, 2/3 of the national budgets are spent for social welfare, for programs, for pension, and for paying those things, and nothing goes for the future. So 2/3 of a budget is just dedicated to the past. What future for Europe?
Dave Bagley, Omaha. A question for John or Barbara. What's your outlook for the near term for the private Greek banking system? Thank you.
Sorry, for the private.
Greek banking system.
Oh, I wouldn't be optimistic about it, but you know, in confusion there is profit.
Not a very good one. Overregulation, 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 Brussels interfering in anything, in everything, and independence of banks is deeply reduced. We also have Basel III, Basel IV is already in process. Our banks still have not restructured themselves. There are serious problems that major banks still have in the East, in Russia, and further. We have not done our homework, and we are not able and willing to let them go bust, which should happen.
When you look back in history, I got a question for the panel. When you look back in history, there are about over 50 million overseas Chinese who immigrate from China, and over 10 million Indian from India. Can you compare and contrast the immigrants' problems with what we are facing right now?
You're talking about overseas Chinese and Indians. I think they're, it depends on which ones you're talking about. I mean, there's a certain entrepreneurial or small business owning Indian and overseas Chinese population. I think of the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, for instance, or the Indians as they existed in East Africa. And then there is the coolie labor of the Western United States in the late 19th century, and the trajectories of those were very different. I mean, I would say that there are tragedies in all three of those immigrations that I've described. You have the expulsion of the Chinese in large degree from the United States. You have the massacre of Indians in East Africa under Idi Amin. You have the Indonesian sort of attacks on Chinese then. You also have success stories, and I think those mostly concern the Chinese entrepreneurs in Southeast Asia. I would say that this European immigration is a mix of both the manual labor type immigration and the entrepreneurial immigration, in which manual labor predominates greatly. I mean, as I said earlier, sort of in an economic sense, probably the illegal immigration is better for the economy than the legal immigration. Europeans always talk about how they need, high-tech scientists, and the Germans have taken a long time trying to create what they call a green card program to get Indians from India. But in fact, the Europeans need people to push wheelchairs and clean dishes too. And so I would say, so as I say, I think it's a mix of those experiences, but with a predominance, with a domination of the manual labor type.
Somewhere on this side, where's the microphone? Back.
Ms. Kolm, for over 2 millennia, there have been disagreements between what we would now call Germany and what we now call France, and the people who've lived in those areas going back to before Julius Caesar. And in the first half of the 20th century, those disagreements were inconvenient for those of us who live in the US and Canada, had to take care of certain problems. It's been great here for the last several years that Team Germany and Team France have managed to find a way to get along. And so from one American's point of view, looking into the future, for the currency to break up seems like it could lead toward additional inconveniences. Are you saying we should expect the currency to break up between Team Germany and Team France? And does that mean the free trade will break up? Will the EU break up?
May I answer that question? I know I answered the last one, but I would like to address one misconception that you hear from Europeans all the time. Is you say, what is the point of this European project and this euro? And they say, 70 years of peace. They always say it. The defenders of the euro always say it, even though the euro is 13 years old, and it was NATO that defended the peace. It was NATO that held up the Cold War. I think as long as there is a Western alliance of a NATO type, I think that is more, I mean, you can argue about whether we need that or not, but I do not think that it is the euro or the European Union that is the custodian of peace in Europe.
Barbara and then John.
Europe has always been most successful when political entities were smaller than economic entities. And I would simply refer that the future for Europe is we have two ways to go now. We are definitely at crossroads if we don't solve this third crisis that I was referring to. One is more integration by all means, one size fits all, going down the drain definitely, because we will lose global competitiveness. And Europe will remain what it is, a beautiful, maybe not so nice place to live because we will have social tensions and unrest, but we will still remain a beautiful country with a great history and great traditions. This is one way. I don't like that. The better way, and here comes my free market and freedom-loving individual, I would love and I would like to see common borders, the 4 freedoms that are not in practice yet, and we keep breaking all the rules. I didn't cover that at the talk, but the 4 freedoms, working and competing regions, a Europe of competing regions where all the diversity that we have, that has added to what we are, to our roots, that this can flourish and that this can become a synergy for everything. So whether we have the euro as a currency, this is a technical question. We have seen many currencies come and go in Europe. I'm very neutral about that. But we need to, if we have a currency, then this currency needs to stick to the rules that are made, that have been made at the beginning. And we have broken the Maastricht criteria and many, many, many other laws and regulations that we have imposed on us ourselves because we wanted to keep this political project, the European Union, alive. But it doesn't have a future if we continue like that. So we have to be more flexible, have to look at alternatives. And Mrs. Merkel is famous for her TINA talk. There is no alternative. There are alternatives. One has to be creative. And just a new technology will bring so much additional challenges and opportunities that I'm positive that we will have to look at our borders, the common borders, but the rest should be very flexible. Europe was more liberal, libertarian, in our sense, libertarian, 100 years ago than it is now. Back then you could move from St. Petersburg to Lisbon without a passport, and you could wire money. You could not wire back then, but you could transport money from Great Britain to Athens without any problems. You didn't have to have a license to be a German hairdresser, to operate in Portugal, etc., etc. So we need to go back to this competing markets system.
Thank you. We have no more time for questions, but I'll give 30 seconds to John to close us out.
You mentioned that the disagreements between France and Germany caused some trouble for this part of the world. That's true. It's also caused some trouble for us, too. I was born in a house in 1942, which, when my mother was carrying me, was bombed by the Luftwaffe. they were in the garden, the Anderson shelter at the time in the garden, and after the bomb had landed and gone through, it didn't explode, it was an incendiary bomb, they went back to bed. And I asked my mother, a very extraordinary thing to do, and she said, well, we were so exhausted during the war, you know. So keep calm and carry on, you know, that's the thing. Now, just to add to Christopher's point, what kept the peace in Europe from 45 onwards was the presence of the United States as a European power with force, because everybody knew the Americans would not tolerate serious differences between the different countries, and they certainly wouldn't tolerate them developing into a violent struggle. The Americans, I hope, will remain there, but the important thing is not to allow the circumstances to be created or to evolve in which these countries feel compelled to battle each other. It seems to me it's not the existence of free trade which is causing the present enormous set of conflicts and annoyances, disagreements between countries, resistance to the EU. It's the fact that parts of the EU, and parts are very good, parts are utopian projects.
Thank you, John.
And if you indulge in utopian projects, you will get people resisting them, and that's what we therefore need to move to the kind of Europe that Barbara was describing.
Please join me in thanking our panel.